What's happening, everybody, and welcome back to the Funky Brain Podcast. My name is Dennis, and this is my Funky Brain. We're taking a little bit of a serious turn, but it's going to be a good factual punch. We talk a lot about alcohol abuse and drug abuse in general and addiction in general, but I have a guy here with a really compelling story. His name is Phil Drum. Phil, how are you doing today, sir?
Just fine. How are you?
I'm awesome. So he received his doctorate in pharmacy from the University of California, 30-plus year licensed pharmacist with a wide range of experiences. He's been active in pharmacy associations and has spoken statewide throughout California and nationally on various pharmaceutical topics. And as a result of a family tragedy, which we're going to talk about here briefly, I'm going to let him do that. He's been very active in research on driving and marijuana and educating the public over the dangers of marijuana in society. So what I'd like to do is talk about real quick, like I had a podcast with Heidi Swan, and we talked a lot about some of this stuff. I went through this too. I was stoned pretty much for like 15 years. And what's your take on all that stuff?
Well, there's a reason why it is a controlled substance, because it is a highly addictive substance, and we've known this for a long time. So it's something that people do get addicted to. When people want to claim that, oh, I don't get addicted, I'm not addicted to marijuana, it's just simply false. It is a hallucinogen. It makes you see things that aren't there and hear things that aren't there. And unfortunately, it's now becoming mainstream, and it's very dangerous for our society.
Yeah, and I also had Dr. Eric Messamore. He's talking about, like, because a lot of people, and I could even attest to a lot of this stuff, you know, going back over 30 years ago when I started smoking. Well, one, the THC was like a fraction of what it is now, the THC content in the marijuana and all the edibles and all the other stuff going on. But when people joke and they say things like, oh, I get paranoid when I smoke, that's a form of psychosis.
Yeah, yes, it is. In my day, I grew up in the 70s as a child. And back then, actually, we had the highest values of marijuana use in the late 70s. But we were talking 0.5 to 2% THC in the marijuana at that time. And now the average THC, if you walked in and say, hey, give me that super strong, Acapulco Gold that's 2% THC, they would laugh you out of the marijuana dispensary. Because on average right now, we're talking in the 20%, especially in Colorado and Washington and California. And the vaping products, the dabbing and those types of products can easily get up into the 90% THC. Some of the edibles you're talking about, a good example that I like relating it to as well is the FDA approved dronabinol, which is Delta-9 THC, and that was approved back in 1985. In fact, that's right around when I was coming out of school. I went to school in UC San Francisco, and there was a little thing called the AIDS epidemic going on in the early 80s in San Francisco at that time. And that's when we approved, the Food and Drug Administration approved Delta-9 THC as dronabinol, as an oral tablet. And the FDA approved it in 1985 at 2.5, 5, and 10 milligrams of THC. But they have 420 bars that have 420 milligrams of THC. In the state of California, they allow 2,000 milligrams to be in a medical product. 2,000. The maximum FDA approved dose is 10. They could put 100 milligrams in a cookie. And they claim that, 10 milligrams is a serving size. Again, that is the FDA maximum approved dose. And they're calling that a serving size, the maximum approved dose. So vastly different from, what we're talking from the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. In the late 90s is when this really took off. And the extraction and going specifically after THC and pulling the THC out of the marijuana, because that is the psychotropic component. However, CBD is another component of marijuana, which tends to be kind of balanced in marijuana, but unfortunately, they are leaning towards the THC very heavily and getting rid of the CBD. When you start hearing about CBD products, again, CBD is approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Yet, again, you're seeing CBD being sold as if it's candy. CBD, I just like to warn people about. The FDA-approved CBD, cannabidiol product, Epidiolex, that was approved in about 500 children for very, very, very rare seizure syndromes. And it was found to be effective in about 39% of the kids. but there was 15% placebo response. So that means it really only works in 25%, 1 in 4, is really the efficacy rate in very, very, very rare seizure syndromes. And they only looked at 500 patients when they approved this. But I encourage anybody to go ahead and take a look at the CBD package insert for Epidiolex and look and see what the warnings and precautions are. They recommend that you check liver function tests in advance of starting CBD, to then check it again later to see, is it damaging your liver? It also warns you about sedation and warns you about not driving under the influence. So does dronabinol and THC, that you should not be driving under the influence of these products. And so there really should be no difference between that and the products that are being sold at marijuana dispensaries. You should not be, in fact, in the state of California, they have to put on the labels, you should not be driving under the influence of THC.
Right, and that's a great lead into the next part that I want to talk about here is the story about your sister. So I'm going to just let you dive into it here. But about 8 years ago, his sister was coming home and got killed by a driver under the influence of marijuana. So if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, my older sister, she was 6 years older than me. She was a nurse, and she was one of the main reasons why I got into medicine. My sister was a nurse, and she worked in Seattle, Washington, and she was driving to work one day, and she was hit head on by a marijuana impaired driver. And it was marijuana only. So for those of you that want to say, oh, what else was he under the influence of? Nothing else, only marijuana. By the time they finally drew the blood level 3 hours and 13 minutes later, his level was 3.2. And so that's very important because, again, THC is a fat-soluble molecule. I think we all know that. We know that it goes in fatty tissue. But when we're drawing blood, that's water. That's water-soluble. And so when we're grabbing something to try and take a look at how much THC is in this person, the psychotropic component, you really need to grab it early because it disseminates into fatty tissue. Your biggest fat organ in your body is right between your ears. Is your brain. And so when we're drawing blood out of your arm, we're not drawing blood out of your brain, which is where the THC is residing. And so what you'll see is a very quick peak in the blood, and it dissipates really quickly. So if you're not grabbing the THC after use, you'll lose about 90% of the blood level within 80 minutes. And it took 3 hours and 13 minutes to draw blood, and it was 3.2. At that time. This was in July of 2012, and coming up in November of 2012 was the election in the state of Washington to legalize marijuana, in which the legal system, the law enforcement, everybody had bought off that, oh, once we legalize it, we don't have to worry about it anymore. My family did not hear about marijuana being involved, and the officers knew right away marijuana was involved because as they uprighted his car, he caused a 5-car pileup. He killed my sister, broke her neck. He had a broken fingernail. And when they uprighted his car, after he crawled through the roof of his car to get out, marijuana and marijuana dispensary cards fell out right in front of the police officer. So they knew exactly what they had within minutes of what they were dealing with here. They were dealing with a marijuana impaired driver. And my family did not hear about it until September, 2 months later, from the insurance company. And when I called the police, they were, mum's the word, talked to the district attorney, and, oh, we're looking into this, and we can't do anything until we get the police report. And so through Freedom of Information, I asked for the police report, and I saw the information and found out he was a 2-time felon on probation at the time for beating his wife while under the influence of marijuana. His first felony was for selling cocaine and marijuana to an undercover police officer. He had 42 court appearances and 49 years of life by the time he killed my sister, getting his 3rd felony. And so ultimately we finally convinced the DA to file the DUI charge. We had to hire a lawyer to do that. And they charged, but it was all kind of set up. Again, they voted for it in November. They didn't arrest him. He went home that night. My sister was dead in the hospital, and he left the hospital. He walked out of the hospital, not arrested. And they didn't file charges on him until the day before the election. And it wasn't until the following year, in 2013, that we finally went to court after we convinced them to file the DUI charge, because now he was looking at a 4.5-year sentence versus a 19-year sentence with his history. And unfortunately, the judge then decided to take matters in her hands, and she threw out the blood evidence the marijuana dispensary cards, and his complete entire history, claiming that he did not consent to the blood draw, which is false because there was a signed consent form. So I think the gig was up. Everything was kind of lined up there in the state of Washington to make sure that everything was just going to go fine with approving marijuana. And since then, there's been several deaths. They've been reporting on it up there of marijuana impaired driving. It's increasing in all states that legalize. Marijuana impaired driving deaths are increasing.
Right. So along those lines, I want to jump into, and you can comment on this, and you can even talk while I'm sharing this video here. It's a video that somebody took with their camera of a person under the influence of marijuana.
There are more people now that are polydrug impaired driving, and this is an example of marijuana, and I believe it's a benzodiazepine, which is is a sedative, is a class of drugs that make you sleep. That he's under the influence of both. So when you start adding these substances together, there's more people that are killing people under the influence of multiple drugs like this guy is. And so what you're going to see here is how he's weaving down the road. Again, people want to claim that a hallucinogen makes them drive better. Really, let's watch how he drives. So this was somebody that was filming him. Unfortunately, they had called the police, but they couldn't get there in time, because you're going to ultimately see what ends up happening. There he is off the road. There he is all the way in the other lane of traffic going around this bend. This is what an impaired driver looks like, people. Again, my sister got hit head on by a driver because the impaired driver felt that the traffic was going too slow in front of him, and he went to the other lane like this guy. And if somebody's coming over that ridge, he would hit them head on. And here's cars now on the other side, and he's going down the road. And right before the end of this video, it cuts off, and you're going to see the ultimate consequence of a little bit around that bend is what we end up seeing right here. There's the white truck. That was a school bus on the other side of the road, which had a non-impaired driver, but the impaired driver killed that driver and several people on that bus because he was impaired under the influence of a benzodiazepine and marijuana. Again, 43% of driving fatalities in the United States now are poly-impaired drug drivers. The most common combination is alcohol and marijuana. It just takes a little bit of marijuana and a little bit of alcohol. Combined together, you combine the central nervous system effects of both. There was a study that was done that was looking at what is the impairing level of THC in the body, and they were doing a simulated driving event, and they had a catheter in the person's arm. They had them smoke first, and then they were checking the blood in their arm at the time they were weaving down the road, like something like what you saw there. And at the time there was the most severe weaving, which was equivalent to a 0.08 blood alcohol. The THC level was 13.1. The important thing is that they also looked at the levels 1 hour and 2 hours later, actually 2.3 hours. And why 2.3 hours was very important to us is I was involved in a study in Colorado in which we looked at driving fatalities and driving assaults, meaning somebody got injured as a result of an impaired driver. And we looked to see how long does it take to draw blood? Because as I told you, you lose 90% of the THC within 80 minutes. The blood level drops 90% within 80 minutes. And so we did a study, and we were just looking at either fatal cases or, again, assaults in which somebody was injured. And the reason why we went after those versus any type of DUI, because there's more mayhem, as you saw that mayhem on the road. And that more mayhem tends to slow down the police in finally getting the blood drawn. And that was the case of my sister, because it took 3 hours and 13 minutes before they finally drew the blood. And so we wanted to see how long on average does it take? And we found out it was 2.3 hours. And so interestingly, in this study that was approved by the National Institute of Health, that they looked at, they did 2.3 hours later. And so 13.1 at the time of driving was causing that same amount of weaving as 0.08. What was that blood level of THC 2.3 hours later? It was around 2. So I know in the state of Colorado, it's a presumptive inference, which is nothing, of 5 nanograms per ml. It really means nothing. The interesting thing about Washington's level, which was approved at the time they legalized marijuana, they approved a per se limit of THC of 5. Very interesting and very smartly in their law, it said if drawn within 2 hours. Now remember, I told you 2.3 hours, your level should be around 2. following a 13.1 at the time of driving. So even 5 is way too high. Okay, that's an entire half-life, meaning it dropped another complete half again to get all the way from 5 down to 2.5 or 2. So anyway, it took 2.3 hours on average to draw blood following an event. How much THC do you think is going to be left in 2.3 hours when you've lost 90% in over an hour and 20 minutes?
Yeah.
And so that's why blood's worthless in these cases. The place we should be sampling is the brain. We should be sampling brain levels, but I don't think we're going to be able to get brain tissue from somebody that's driving erratically down the road. And so that brings me to the point of another fantasy lie that's out there, if you will, that officers can't determine impairment from marijuana. It's a complete fantasy, complete fantasy. They can. There was a study done by Hartman in 2016 in accident analysis and prevention, again by the National Institute of Health group. And they looked at the fatality analysis reporting system, FAR system, that they were looking then for toxicologic blood levels of 1 nanogram or higher. And they were looking then the drug recognition experts that you hear about, that are the officers that are DREs. These are extra trained officers that have undergone 2 weeks worth of additional training to identify people that are impaired driving. And so they had the DREs then assess these people that had a toxicologic confirmed 1 nanogram or higher THC level, and they looked to see could these people identify the correct substance, because they didn't know what they were looking for. They just knew the person was impaired, and they were said, look at this guy and you tell us what you think it is. With 96.7% accuracy, they were able to correctly identify THC when somebody failed 2 or more of the following. So I think a lot of people know about finger to nose, right? That one that they have you do. So if you had 3 or more failures of the finger to nose when they're having you do that, that was one of the 2. Another one was eyelid tremors. Something that THC causes is the eyelids to actually they flicker. And so if they see them flickering when they're trying to do the modified Romberg balance test, and their eyelids are flickering, that's indicative of THC exposure. And so if they do that, there's another one. If they have 2 or more one-legged stand clues, that's where they have you stand on one leg, right? If you're falling off or having to rebalance and things like that, those are clues. And then 2 or more in the walk and turn, take the 9 steps, turn around and walk back. So those things that you've heard of for alcohol determination, for impaired driving, they work for marijuana. So don't believe that lie that they don't work, they do. And in this case, they showed 96.7% prediction of cannabis impairment. All they needed to do was identify 2 or more of those standard field sobriety test failures. They also found other things like increased heart rate, increased systolic blood pressure, dilated pupils were other things that they saw that did reach some statistically significant differences. Again, I think a lot of people that use marijuana also report, yeah, I feel like my heart's kind of bouncing out of my chest. Well, there you go. If the officer, the DRE, will be checking your pulse multiple times, and this is the same case as the person that murdered my sister had elevated heart rates and blood pressure because he was under the influence. So very interesting. They can detect it. They've looked at other studies, looked at over 5,000 people in Southern California, in Orange County, in 2010 to 2012 in Orange County, and the standard field sobriety tests were found to be sensitive to impairment by marijuana. There was no correlation between the standard field sobriety tests and the THC in whole blood. So once again, saying that blood determination is kind of worthless. The driving behaviors that they were seeing were similar to alcohol. Again, you're taking a hallucinogen and a central nervous system depressant that, again, people are seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that aren't there, and yet people want to tell me they drive better. I find that hard to believe. We also know that it does cause tunnel vision. And there's studies out there in which they only see a center portion of their visual field, which is very dangerous. And I know several people in cases and they've lost their family members. In fact, I know a woman in Ohio who lost her daughter in exactly same Similar event that happened to my sister within the same week back in 2012. But she got T-boned because the guy ran a red light because he didn't see it. He didn't see the red lights. Where are the red lights? Overhead, can't see it if you have tunnel vision. And you don't see it to the sides. And so that's the problem, is that they don't see the traffic lights and they go right through the intersection and they're T-boning people.
Yeah, that's crazy stuff. And then there are a lot of accidents that we don't hear about too, I know.
Yeah, we call them crashes. We don't call them accidents because there's no accident that they took marijuana, and it's no accident that they were behind the wheel of a car. That was all intentional, and it really should be second-degree murder is what they should be charged for. They've changed the term to lessen it, make it nicer. It's vehicular homicide. No, it's actually second-degree murder. You've put yourself in a predicament and in a situation that you could kill somebody. So you have intentionally taken a drug. Nobody forced that marijuana down your throat. And you've intentionally gotten behind the wheel of a car in which you can kill somebody. That's second-degree murder, and that's really what we should be calling it, second-degree murder. It's not first degree because you're not intending to kill somebody, but you're putting yourself in that predicament that you can kill somebody, and they do.
This happens definitely in the driving scene. So we're talking about people that are above driving age. But what about these kids? What kind of effects is the marijuana and combination with other drugs, all the stuff that they're doing? What's going on with these kids? How is it affecting them?
Yeah, it's affecting them, much in the same way. Again, they tend to be more erratic, as we know. And so with their driving not being as safe, this makes it even less safe because now you've impaired their reasoning, and which marijuana does that. And it impairs their ability to step on the brake. And they do speed. That's, again, another Cheech and Chong fantasy that people are driving slow. That's absolute fantasy, in which, again, over 42% in the FARS databases, we've done the research to show this, 42% of driving fatalities involving marijuana, they were speeding at the time of the fatality. Combine that with alcohol, and now you're over 50%.
So what kind of laws do you think that are going to be up and coming that might prevent any of this, or at least preempt some of it?
Yeah, unfortunately, the marijuana industry is very adept and has purchased our legislature. And it's very difficult to get any laws. I spoke on behalf of a law in 2014, and I had the chair of the Public Safety Committee, in which kind of told his staffers that you really need to change the name of your committee because you're not here for public safety. Because the guy said, we had a bill going before in the state of California back in 2014, saying, here are blood levels for various drugs. And he blatantly said, the chairman from San Francisco said, this has THC in it, and I don't care about the heroin, I don't care about the methadone, I don't care about any of these other drugs. It's got THC in it, and I'm telling everybody to vote this down. All of my fellow Democrats need to vote this down. And they did. They all followed his lead, and they voted it down. The bill never made it out of the Public Safety Committee. Again, blood levels to me are worthless. Again, other countries that are much more adept at dealing with impaired driving, I wouldn't say that we have to be like African countries. There are some African countries that it's the death penalty if you're caught driving impaired. But there are other countries, France and other countries, will say zero tolerance. There's zero tolerance in you driving impaired. You cannot be putting the rest of society at risk. And that's what these people are doing. And so, and when does this happen? I can tell you, I've done the research. We looked at the FARS database, and we saw this is happening. The marijuana impaired drivers are killing people during rush hour. The peak deaths in the United States of America when marijuana is present is between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. If you add alcohol to it, now it's 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. Why? We suspect that they went to the bar for 2 hours. Why is it 4 to 8? That's when they're getting off of work. So they get off of work, they're smoking in their car, and they're crashing into other people going down the road. Because again, it took 10 to 15 minutes to hit their high, and here they are in mass transit with a lot of people around, a lot of victims now are around that they can take out. There's also another peak, interestingly, 7 to 8 a.m. So before work and after work. And alcohol, I think a lot of people know this. When are the alcohol deaths occurring? 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Why 2 a.m.? That's when they close the bars. So the peak time for alcohol alone is 10 p.m. at night to 2 a.m. Well, how many people were out on the road at that time? So we also saw, interestingly, in our papers that we've written and analyzed, we saw more innocent victims are being killed. on the road, pedestrians, bicyclists, other drivers, when you're talking marijuana. Why? Because they're doing their driving during rush hour traffic, when there's a lot of other people on the road, like my sister in the morning driving to work at 6:22 a.m. He was already stoned going to work, driving fast, driving down the center turn lane, driving towards a car that was stopped legally, attempting to make a left-hand turn, and at the last second realized he was going to hit that car head on, and he pulled not to the right to get back to where he was, he pulled to the left, right towards my sister, going 35 in the opposite direction. He would have done a lot less damage had he hit that parked vehicle just by physics than by hitting my sister going 35 in the opposite direction. He was speeding, driving down a center turn lane, pulled into my sister. She had nowhere to go. There was a car to her right, and there was the parked vehicle to her left. She had nowhere to go. She was stuck. The guy to her right reported, I first felt a bump from the car to my left, which was my sister, and then I felt a shove. The bump was my sister trying to get out of the way, and the shove was when he hit her into him. He lost his two wheels, went flying down the road, had a broken fingernail. My sister had to be cut out of her car. She had a broken neck and was dead on arrival.
Crazy stuff. So it sounds to me like the only real way to get the awareness out is things like this, like appearing on podcasts or shows where you can, be vocal about it. But it's not hopeful to get these messages out.
Yeah, the marijuana industry has purchased our legislature. For us to get any laws out there, it'll never happen. In fact, last year in the state of California, we had a bill that made it all the way through. It was overwhelmingly supported by our Assembly and Senate, made it to the governor. Our governor, Gavin Newsom, supported Prop 64, the legalization bill, as lieutenant governor. So as governor, he got this bill that now was going to require the coroners to test for drugs in driving fatalities, because they're not testing for drugs. And so if they don't test for it, they won't find it. And so this was going to require them to test for it. The governor vetoed the bill. It had overwhelming support from the Assembly and Senate. And when I asked, why aren't you going to do your job and override his veto? You could override his veto. The response from the bill author, well, we never override a governor's veto in the state of California. It hasn't happened since the 1970s. So there you go. The marijuana industry knew that the governor had their back, and the assembly could just play along with it all the way to the point in which the bill made it to his desk in September, and he was just going to veto it. One of our recommendations, I sat on the impaired driving task force for the state of California, which was required as a result of Prop 64. And one of the recommendations that we now have going forward again is to make that mandatory for the coroner to do that $300 test. They're getting paid $3,000 to do an autopsy. I, as a pharmacist, can close my eyes, put my hand over the body and go, blunt force trauma killed this person. That's essentially what the coroners are doing by performing their autopsy, saying blunt force trauma, but not performing the $300 drug test to figure out what led to that crash. So we need to get a bill, we need to get a law that forces the coroner to do that $300 test. So then we can start having the data to prove that people are dying from polydrug overdoses because they're not doing it on their own. Yeah, so again, I would say zero tolerance. We have oral swabs that can detect the presence of multiple drugs at the roadside. Unfortunately, they're not levels that people want to see a level. I want to see a level. I want to see a level. Okay, you want to see a level? Let's start doing brain testing. Okay, because that's where the THC resides. The THC resides in fat. You're grabbing a blood level. That's not fat. That's water. So if you really want to see a blood level, let's start doing some brain biopsies on these people, because then that will tell us what the impact is on the brain. Otherwise, we have to then assume that, we're going to use those same standard field sobriety tests that we've been using for, decades to determine alcohol impairment. Because if you're impaired, if you're showing the same symptoms of impairment under the influence of marijuana, then how can you say you're not impaired? Because they are. Because they are, as I just mentioned.
I thought there was a test where you can blow and detect.
There's alcohol. There's the alcohol blood, the blow test, and that one's passed and is correlating to the blood level, so they can do that on those. There's also a preliminary PAS, preliminary alcohol screen, they call it, that they could do at the roadside, and then they'll do another one, the real one, inside the office typically. But another thing about alcohol is we can back extrapolate it to know what it was. If they draw it an hour later, we know that we have to add back 0.015 for every hour that it takes you to draw the blood. You just add that back because we know that the body eliminates at a certain rate of alcohol. That's not true for marijuana, not true. So we cannot back extrapolate marijuana. So we do have a breath test for alcohol. They are working on it for marijuana. Again, they're saying, oh, well, it'll tell us if they used within 2 to 3 hours. What did I tell you Colorado's research showed? 6 to 8 hours you are impaired. You don't even peak with an edible for 3 hours. So I've talked to those folks that say, oh, well, this will tell us if they used within 2. I go, keep going. You need to go up to 8. You need to go at least for an edible up to 3 because they're not even going to peak for 3 hours. 2 hours isn't even long enough to determine so again, they've got a lot of problems with that's why they haven't approved it with this. But again, as a preliminary screen, it would be okay to say, yeah, they're positive. I don't think we need to have a level. If somebody is deemed to be impaired by the officer, that should be enough. They're not pulling people over and testing people. They have to have probable cause, and that's typically that they're smashing into people, they're weaving down the road, they're driving without their headlights on. Something's led to that probable cause to be able to start testing them. And if they're found to be positive, in other countries they do this, zero tolerance. In Italy, they did a study, and they looked at the carboxy metabolite, which is not psychoactive. And they found the presence of it in the urine increases the risk, an odds ratio 10-fold of being involved in a crash if the carboxy metabolite is in the urine. Our own Department of Transportation uses the carboxy metabolite in the urine. So I've asked my congressman, why are you not having the United States of America also adopt that Department of Transportation standard that we have for school bus drivers and interstate truckers and ship operators and pilots and all these other transportation people? They're under that limit of a carboxy metabolite in the urine. And I told my House of Representative person, Mark DeSallier, who sits on the House's Transportation Department, I warned him that one day somebody in a big white SUV is going to take out a school bus. And you saw that video of what I predicted to Mark DeSallier. And what did he do? Nothing. He's done nothing with me predicting reality. 13 people died, not the driver, not the impaired driver, but the other people in the school bus did. It happens. It happens every day. In the state of California, we're easily losing a Californian a day on our roadways due to marijuana impaired drivers because they're not testing enough people. And when you do the FARS database, we found that there were 220 happening in 2016. This was before legalization even kicked in here. We had 220 that were marijuana positive fatalities. Half of them, about half were the drivers and half was an innocent victim. And so what the FARS database actually does is they take half of the percent, the percent then was running 19% positivity. So if you take another 9% and multiply 9% times all the times it wasn't tested, you had over 600 cases then in California. So 365 is a very generous number from 220. To say one a day, it's probably more like 1.5 to 2 people a day in the state of California are dying as a result of impaired drivers from marijuana on the roadway, easily. The things that get reported, unfortunately, in the news just say the driver was impaired, and they never tell you what it was. They never come back and tell you what it was. You'll never hear about it in the news as to, yeah, it was marijuana. They don't tell you that.
Well, and I think we're also desensitized to it all right now anyway.
Even some famous people that almost got killed by, I suspect, impaired marijuana drivers on our roadways there in California. We had a CHP officer parked on the side of the road on Christmas Eve that didn't go home to his little kids because he got plowed into from behind by a guy going over 100 miles an hour that was high on alcohol and marijuana on 880, not too far from where I live. Killed him. He was the passenger. They were on the side of the road on the freeway looking for drunk drivers on Christmas Eve. He didn't go to home to his little kids. He was killed. The passenger. Not the driver. They were parked, and this guy slammed into the back of them. going over 100 miles an hour. Again, the fantasy that they drive slow. No, they don't. They speed. And when you add alcohol, over half the fatality cases of alcohol and marijuana are speeding at the time of the fatality.
That's crazy stuff, man. Well, I have a feeling that we could probably do another episode because you have a lot of information, very compelling, crazy story about your sister, and a lot of awesome, compelling facts and figures. So, and thank you so much for sharing it here on the Funky Brain podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Phil. I appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for watching the Funky Brain podcast. Have a great day today. Be safe out there. Talk to you soon. Bye. One of the biggest questions I hear all the time is, what does it take to create lasting change in my life? Well, it depends on what's going on in your life. Are you struggling with alcoholism or an addiction of any type, like food or shopping or smoking or your iPhone or porn? Are you having health problems or relationship problems? Do you want to lose 30 pounds or 100 pounds? Do you have a brilliant business idea that you just can't seem to get off the ground? Have you been trying to write your book for years but keep procrastinating? Are you in debt up to your eyeballs and don't know how to get out of it? You want to run a marathon? Well, one of the biggest hurdles in achieving these life-changing goals is consistency. A great example I like to use is when you hear, I tried that diet, but it didn't work. Well, the truth is that it did work. You probably stopped working at it. How does that all play out? Well, you go on a diet, you do what it says, you stop eating sugar and processed foods and crap, you start exercising, moving your body more, and then you lose 30 pounds. So you start eating cheesecake and fast food again, and you gain it all back. So what happened there? There was no accountability. And of course, no consistency in your life. This is where having a high performance coach in your life comes into play. We decide what it is you want to achieve, whether it's sobriety, healthy relationships, weight loss, or whatever. Then we create specific action steps to get these done on a daily basis. And then we radically change your life forever. As a master life coach and best-selling author, I've been working with both men and women worldwide for over 15 years to help them kick their addictions and master their lives. I'm currently working with clients in Canada, England, New Zealand, and of course throughout the United States here. Set up your first free session today. Don't wait till tomorrow or for the perfect time to get started. Now is the perfect time to change your life forever. I'll see you soon. Have a beautiful day.